Good day. I'm Laurence Sanford, Senior Analyst with the American Security Council Foundation. Our mission is peace through strength, and we're here to discuss today. I'm delighted to have Hollie McKay, a war correspondent, author, mother, world traveler, and she won't sound it to you folks, but she's got to be a little nuts compared to some of the things she's done from where I can perspective. So we'll discuss her adventures in Afghanistan and her world travels. And the thing that interested me initially about Hollie was an article I read in Cyber Brief concerning the Sahel, which is that band of sand, the desert in North Africa that stretches from one side of Africa to the other, and where the Islamic militants are taking over. And Hollie has extensive experiences covering not only the Sahel and Afghanistan, but also Iraq and other areas. So I contacted Hollie and asked her if she'd discuss with us her understanding what's going on to the Sahel, but I also want to discuss with her her experiences where when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, Hollie was there, and then even more amazingly, she stayed there. And so we'll discuss that after the Sahel. So Hollie, would you please just discuss your article a little bit for our readers or listeners?
Absolutely. So the Sahel is absolutely a hotbed of terrorism that doesn't get a huge amount of coverage. And when you really dig down on what's happening there, it's really quite terrifying. So the Sahel now accounts for over half of the global terrorism deaths. So last year, 51% of all terrorism-related deaths happened in this region. And conflict fatalities are nearly 10 times what they were in 2019. So I repeat that. Now in 2025, conflict fatalities are 10 times what they were in 2009. So there is really just so much that is happening here. There are so many frequent terrorist attacks that, again, they don't make headline news. You've got Islamic State in the Sahel province, where militants will sort of go out and attack dozens and kill dozens at one time. We saw that happen in Niger, and I think that was called the Manda massacre. And that was a huge wake-up call to really what's happening. But that really is not the only terror group to be concerned about. Of course, we've also got al-Qaeda affiliates, and one in particular that is currently surrounding the capital of Mali, Bamako, and at some point, there is a lot of concern that it could actually take over the capital. So you could have an al-Qaeda affiliate taking over the capital city in Mali. And of course, that what happens in Mali doesn't stay in Mali, and that would have just huge ramifications across the region. So really these jihadist groups, and there are many of them operating, across the Sahel, quite bluntly, and they really, I guess, learned to adapt over the last 6 years in particular. They're adapting with things like motorcycles for fast raids. They've got their hands on offensive drones. The Al-Qaeda affiliate in Mali, Jinim, has done 30 plus drones since late 2023, 30 plus drones, massive strikes. You've got suicide drones, and they're also taking advantage of Starlink communications in remote areas. So that has also made it much harder for intelligence agencies to counter them. So there's so many factors happening in the region. Of course, France, which had sort of a large presence in Mali in particular, they withdrew several years ago. You've seen a much larger footprint of Russians come in, what was the Wagner Group and is now called Africa Corps, which were brought in to essentially help some of these governments get rid of these terrorist elements. But what we've seen is that the Russians really haven't been doing that. They've been much more focused on pillaging and taking whatever resources that they can, rather than supporting these governments. So quite frankly, it's a really big mess in the Sahel at the moment.
So a couple of questions. First, describe the countries. Does it go from Mauritania all the way over to Sudan? Is that basically the whole North Africa area, or is that basically?
Yeah, I think technically it's 10 countries. So you've got Burkina Faso, Chad, the Gambia, Sudan, another crazy situation there. Mali, Mauritania, Cameroon, Niger, Senegal, and Guinea.
Okay, so these terrorists are persecuting Christians big time in Nigeria and other places, but they're also killing Muslims too. And why would they be killing the Muslims? Just for the power control?
I mean, I think that comes down to what we've seen, particularly with ISIS-affiliated groups and also in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan and other countries they've operated. Anyone that's not sort of adhering to their very, very sort of stringent approach to Sharia law and what they believe to be, the law of the caliphate is going to find themselves in deep trouble. So this is not a group that has any sort of extra sympathies for the Muslim population.
And does this transpose itself into places like the Middle East now? For example, ISIS was big time in Iraq, and they were pretty much downsized. But this seems to be raising their heads again. So what is this? Let's stay with the Sahel. What is the solution for the West, or the United States, or the world for that matter, to counter these terrorists?
Yeah, and I think in places like Iraq and Syria, where ISIS once had sort of control over these major cities and regions, it no longer has that. But it certainly still operates cells that can do a lot of damage. And that never went away. And really seeing, I think, Africa take the mantle that the Middle East once had in terrorism is that seems to have spread a lot to Africa. And the solutions, I think, I mean, if there was one good solution, that would make life easier. But I certainly think, and I think that the administration is starting to kind of recognize this, is that we can't disengage, that disengagement doesn't work. When the US particularly kind of stands back or looks away, these things tend to flourish. So we've seen with France and other countries that have tried to, play a role in stabilization, and it just hasn't worked. And a lot of that comes down to colonial history, distrust, and I really think that the U.S. still needs to be the leader in some of these areas. And that doesn't necessarily mean boots on the ground, but it could mean, enlisting the help of an allied nation in the region. For example, the US could turn to Morocco or to another country that it does have strong relationships with, and perhaps forge an agreement where maybe they have their troops on the ground and the US obviously, supplies weapons and backs them in that. But I think that, when we don't pay attention to these things, they flourish, and that is very destabilizing for everybody. So I think that the best bet right now is really the U.S. leveraging its partnerships in this region.
It's very difficult, and you have Trump threatening Nigeria to take military action. I'm sure that didn't engender himself with the present government of Nigeria. So I'm with you on that one. No U.S. boots on the ground for sure. And because we were kicked out of, was it Niger? We had a relationship in Niger or Mali that we had military boots on the ground.
Yeah, we had boots. Yeah, AfricaCom was kind of operating there. And then if you remember, was it 2017 when several special forces soldiers were killed in Niger, and there was sort of an uproar because a lot of people, were not aware that we even had troops operating there. So I think that there's been, an overhaul of that system since then, and an effort to kind of peel back and hopefully be a little bit more transparent about where Americans are in the region.
It is certainly convoluted. I mean, in Sudan, for example, you get different Arab countries, Muslim countries supporting different factions, the two factions in Sudan. And the U.S. is trying to mediate between the two factions. Is there any hope, or do you have a suggested game plan as to what the U.S. role should be?
Yeah, I mean, what's happening in Sudan and Darfur is just absolutely heartbreaking. It's somewhere that I've spent a lot of time, and just this, in my career, I've never heard such horrific stories of such a dehumanization of a population. Just one of those things that keeps me awake at night. I get the sense that particularly after this MBS visit, some comments that I read this morning from President Trump, that he was a lot more interested in the region. I think that obviously came from a little bit of nudging from MBS. So we may see a little bit more action from the US. The struggle right now is that sort of we're relying on this quote unquote quad, which includes the UAE and other groups, when to be the solution and to come up with a peace deal when these are the countries that are essentially arming and inflaming what is happening. So I don't know that is the most sensible way forward. Sudan has really devolved into this proxy war where So many countries, have a different hand, as I said. The UAE, Libya, other countries are kind of backing the RSF militias. And then on the other side, oddly enough, you've got Saudi Arabia backing SAF, but you also have Iran backing them too. When those two are kind of sworn enemies.
Yes.
And then you have Turkey involved. You've got so many different players in this that it's going to kind of be challenging for the US to unravel what is happening. But again, I see this as a place where we have to take that leadership position because, this it can't continue, even just from a humanitarian point of view. It's really, it's things that I've never heard in my career.
And your career was many years with Fox News Digital, is that correct? Yeah, so
That is.
yeah. So how long did you spend in the Sudan, for example?
So I've been covering different parts of Africa for the last 6 years. My most recent trip since this war flared up, and that was in April of 23. And I spent a couple of months there, sort of in between from the end of last year through to the beginning of this year.
Wow. Okay. So let's go back to Afghanistan because that to me is a sore point as to the way the U.S. Left Afghanistan. And you had mentioned in one of your podcasts that you were there a few days before the Taliban took over. So could you just recount your impressions while you were in Afghanistan, in Kabul? When
Yes.
it was a
Sure. So I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan sort of throughout the course of the war. It's sort of one of those places that captures you in many different ways. And I felt that it was just going to be an important story. And so sort of early in 2021, that's when I left my job at Fox and wanted to move back to Afghanistan because I kind of, the impression that I was given was that was irrelevant, wasn't going to be an important story. And I think when you've been doing this work a long time, you really develop an eye for, what is going to happen next and what will be an important story. So I really followed my instinct with that and decided, no, this was the time to go, take a leap, be independent, see how I could make that work. So I went back and met up with my photographer, who is also Australian, and we decided, we were going to kind of work on a book project. And then, we got there, and again, it sort of felt like inevitable that at some point, the government wasn't going to hold, but I certainly personally didn't expect it to happen that quickly. So in the sort of the days leading up to that fall, you just sort of started to see provinces in the north, falling very quickly. I would see soldiers just walking off their base. I'd say, "Where are you going?" And they just sort of shrugged and said, "We're going home." And that was a real doomsday thought for me because, if Afghans weren't willing to fight, then who was, And so we ended up going to Mazar Sharif. I was invited there by General Dostum, who was quite a sort of storied and controversial figure, very much supported the US. He's an Uzbek, very much supported the US post 9/11, but was also banned from the US due to, human rights violations. So controversial figure, but kind of this towering guy who you wouldn't suspect was going to just leave. And so we went there, and then as the days are going by, you sort of started to see vigor being taken out. So at first, everything was normal, markets were normal, everybody was sort of getting on with their life. Refugees from other provinces were sort of fleeing there. So there was a lot of uncertainty, but everybody you talk to, from an Afghan intelligence official in Kabul to the special forces commandos on the ground, were absolutely convinced that there was no way that Mazar Sharif was going to fall. And then I guess the day that it did happen, that was a Saturday, and suddenly it became this sort of ghost town, and it was eerie, and you had people lining up outside the banks trying to get all their money out so that they could go to Kabul, with the theory that Kabul wasn't going to fall. You had people fleeing from the outskirts on these little tuk-tuks, coming into the city, and we kind of drove out about midday to interview some people, and then our driver kind of turned around and he said, "Oh, look, the Taliban is sort of surrounding it outside. I don't think we can go any further." And he was scared, so we turned around and went back. And And then by that evening, we'd gone out to get something to eat, and it was just absolutely dead quiet, which was incredibly unusual. And we both just hurried back to our hotel. And, as we were coming back, you just saw all the motorcycles coming in, and that was them taking over Mazar, and there wasn't a shot fired. And I also might add, what was very strange to me in the days leading up to the fall was that I saw barely any soldiers. I saw no police presence on the street. I certainly didn't hear any aircraft. And yet, we had this sort of $80 million Air Force that the US had built. And I saw none of that. And that felt strange to me because all the provinces surrounding Mazar had fallen. So I thought, well, they must be having a tight grip on Mazar, but that certainly wasn't the case. And then, so yeah, it fell, quite quickly on that Saturday night, and Kabul fell the next day. And so when that happened, that was sort of an extra layer of, oh goodness, how am I going to get out of here? And at that point, of course, we weren't sure how the Taliban was going to react to a journalist, a foreigner, a woman. So there were many different factors sort of at play. So yeah, it was a interesting time, to say the least.
But they let you stay there. For how long were you there after the fall?
They did. Yeah, so I ended up, my only way out was to communicate with them. So they honored. They told me that I could go back to Kabul, and they would give me sort of a permission letter to continue my work. And I had my visa valid through to the end of that year. So to me, it felt important to stay, and I felt secure in that decision. So I stayed through, to the end of my visa, to the end of the year. And then I actually went back also for a little bit in 2022 as well.
Is that the Australian visa or is it an American visa?
For Afghanistan, always Australian.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Much safer.
Yeah. So how did it happen? I mean, did they just absolute corruption of the military?
I really think corruption was a huge, huge role in it. And that was something that I felt that I had been banging my head about for so many years. And certainly there were the cigar reports. There was no hiding what was happening in Afghanistan. I mean, the corruption was so systemic on every possible level. This wasn't just happening at the top. It was just happening on just every level possible. Somebody taking a piece of the pie. I had people that would tell me that just to get an interview at a job at the US Embassy, they would have to come up with some crazy figure like $5,000 just to get a foot in the door for that interview. Otherwise, you would never even be considered for a job. And of course, this was not coming directly from the Americans. This was coming from, the Afghans that were kind of in charge of the preliminary process. And then you also just the infrastructure. So USAID would, maybe give $20 million for a road to be built. And then, that road would break and be full of potholes and be gone in 6 months because that $20 million went to a contractor who subcontracted it to someone else for maybe $2 million. And then they subcontracted to someone else for $200,000 with the crappiest parts you can find. So suddenly the $20 million project, only $20,000 was being spent on it. And of course it fell apart. And that's just an example of sort of how systemic the corruption was. And something that made me very mad because, as an American, I would say this was my money. This was my money as a taxpayer that we gave to support this country. And it's sort of no wonder that things happened the way it happened because money was never going to where it was supposed to go. So, in many ways, yes, it didn't come as a surprise that things that fell apart so rapidly because there just wasn't a strong infrastructure, both physically and through personnel. It just wasn't there. There wasn't the willingness to fight for a country. And that's something the Taliban had. These Taliban fighters weren't getting paid a lot of money, but they had a certain will and a drive that I think that many of the Afghan forces, not all, of course, but many of the Afghan forces lacked.
Yes. And the thing that to me is amazing is I spent 4 years with the agency, the CIA, and I was in the Navy. And one of the things that amazed me is that the U.S. government, so-called clandestine services, didn't understand the situation better, or they didn't act upon what was fairly common knowledge about the absolute corruption and lack of will within the military of Afghanistan. I just find this very difficult to comprehend, but I guess.
Yeah, and I think that even though officials were completely aware it was happening, I think they just thought it was a systemic issue that they couldn't resolve, without really realizing it was the issue.
Yeah.
And I think if looking back, if the US had really taken a hardline stance right from the get-go, was absolutely no, we are not going to tolerate this, then things may be different in Afghanistan today. But
Yeah. It is
yeah,
what it is.
not the case.
I know. Yeah. And I think you mentioned on that podcast that I watched that the same corruption issue was also in Iraq, as one of the big issues in Iraq was the corruption issues.
Absolutely. Once again, Iraq, given its oil reserves, there's no reason Iraq couldn't be Bahrain or United Arab Emirates, but
Yeah.
Iraq is Iraq, and that is to do because of, the ongoing absolute pilfering from every level. And that is a shame because Iraq will, while these sort of issues are so systemic in the way that it runs, and when I say systemic, it's just so ingrained that I'm not even sure that how many people see it as wrong anymore. At least people involved in that they, may not even judge what they're doing as being wrong because it's what you do. But as long as that continues, then Iraq, isn't going to become kind of an overnight success.
And you wrote a book about this, Only Cry for the Living, based on your experiences in Iraq and so forth. Did it go over well, by the way? Did you do well on it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I hope so. It's been out there for a few years now, and I continue to get good feedback, and it certainly is a labor of love. So I tried, in many over the course of many years that I was based sort of in Iraq or going back and forth. I think in particular with the ISIS conflict, what I really tried to do was get every side of the story that I could. So it wasn't just about what the U.S. military was doing or what the Iraqi army was doing or the Peshmerga. It was about what they were doing, but it was also about what the ISIS fighters thought. And I tried to interview as many as I could. And then what these different factions in Syria and Turkey and Iraq sort of thought. And then, what's most important to me is really what the people on the ground, what they experience. The people that are just sort of caught in the crossfire in these situations. And sometimes they're the ones that can paint the best picture of a conflict. We can look at statistics all day. We can look at numbers, but when you hear those personal stories of those who were just directly impacted by these things,
yes.
I think we can get a much bigger from the micro, we can get the macro understanding of a conflict. So with all my reporting, regardless of where I am, that's something that I really do try to focus on.
Yes, and you got involved in the sex slaveries and the Yazidi treatments by the ISIS and so forth, so you sort of taken that and developed some causes to exploit, or not exploit, but to expose the.
Yeah, I mean, that was just so heartbreaking. There were just thousands and thousands of these young girls and women that were taken, by ISIS. Basically, ISIS surrounded the bottom of their village in the Sinjar region and just massacred many men, took many of the women as sex slaves, and a lot of them are still missing today. Thousands are still missing today, and at this point, they've probably had a number of children and don't want to return home. But they may also just be incredibly brainwashed and given a new Arab name and ingratiated into a new family, and in some cases moved to a new country. So the chance of them ever kind of going back to their home is very little. So it's just the scale of that tragedy is very hard to wrap my head around.
So how did you arrange interviews with ISIS? I mean, here you are, an Australian woman in there. I mean, ISIS is not exactly known for being friendly to foreigners, let alone a foreign woman.
Yeah, so in Iraq specifically, most of them were jailed. ISIS people that had been detained already by various authorities. And so I was able to kind of arrange the interviews through the authorities, which still was difficult in and of itself. And then, so that was for, Iraq, Syria in particular. But in Afghanistan, I interviewed ISIS fighters that were, still out. A lot of them were released by the Taliban once they took over, and a lot of the jails, basically, the doors were opened in Bagram and other places, and they kind of fled and then basically went straight back to being ISIS fighters. And again, those things, they come up through people in the case of one case in Afghanistan was that sort of a driver that we had just for one particular area to go to the Kurungal. So it wasn't a driver that I knew or used regularly, but a driver that was sort of contracted. He said, oh, my cousin's neighbor is ISIS, and I know where he is. And so that's kind of how it works. And again, it's one family, in Afghanistan, one family, you can have two brothers that are ISIS, another brother of Taliban, the other one was an Afghan army person. So it's not as divided as we maybe tend to think it is here.
Yeah. So what is your current points of interest? I mean, do you have another foreign assignment where you want to take another closer look at, or are you bouncing back between Afghanistan and Northern Africa?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly still very passionate about what is happening in Sudan in particular. And I just, would do anything to see that conflict resolved in some way. I'm also very interested in what's happening in Latin America. I think, Venezuela, it's sort of been a boiling point for a long time. And, we may see something significant happen there in the next weeks or months. I think the administration has sort of made it clear that Maduro doesn't have a future. So the question now is really, what's going to happen next? Is Maduro going to leave on his own volition? Is the US going to accept that? What does that look like? So I certainly think that's going to be an important point. And the other place that I feel very passionate about working in, that I try to spend, each year, spend some time in, and that's Mexico. It doesn't always make the headlines, but honestly, it's our neighbor. And there are so many important stories being told there, not only from what the cartels are, how they're operating, how they're getting through the border, but just, again, the people that are really affected by it, the mothers whose children have just disappeared. And there is upwards of 150,000 people just disappeared in Mexico, and they don't get a lot of support from the government or the police. Again, corruption, unless they're willing to pay copious amounts of money, they're not going to get any help. So they form their own collectives to try to locate their children. In some cases, it's been 15 or so years that their children were presumably taken by organized crime groups or cartels, and these poor parents are basically left to fend for themselves. So I see so many important stories, in Mexico and Central America.
I know sometimes it's difficult to decide which is a greater crisis. It seems like they're going on everywhere in the world. So on a happier note, would you just briefly describe why you wanted to go to Marrakesh and what happened when you went to Marrakesh with your daughter?
Oh yeah, that was such a special trip. So my husband and I, and we have friends in Morocco. So we decided in September to make a trip there, and it was both our first times in that country. And I've always wanted to go to Marrakesh. I can't necessarily tell you why. Ever since I was a little girl, I had this sort of, I guess, obsession with it. It just seemed like this sort of wanderlust place of spices and smells, and it's so much that was sort of removed from my day-to-day life. And I think for me, being there, I guess really heightened how challenging it is for us to disconnect ourselves from the world. And when we're so immersed in geopolitics and wars and the news and what's happening, and how much I really struggled to sort of switch off. And here I was in this place that I dreamt about being in since I was a child, and yet was finding it so hard to, put my phone away and just kind of take a moment for myself. So that was a real wake-up call about the importance of, I guess, looking after ourselves, as individuals, and being able to separate myself from my work, and be in the moment, be present, and experience these things, and it's particularly through, my toddler's eyes as well, and just what, a special moment that was. And I think just a good wake up call for all of us, that when we do get in our heads, immersed in the world, how important it is to take a step back and recognize that we can't solve all the conflicts that are happening. That my sleepless nights about it aren't going to change the equation, and I think it's very important to have that sense of compartmentalization.
I would tell you, for one who's trying to take care of himself for more than 30 years, that being able to sleep at night is an important factor. So your ability to step away from the present world so you can at least take a good night's sleep is important for your own health and well-being and mind. So yeah, it's important to step away and take care of yourself physically and mentally, and socially too, for that matter. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. So do you have any closing thoughts? I mean, I've really enjoyed listening to you describe your adventures, and I still stand by that. You've got to be slightly nuts, though, to go to these places and do what you do. But I always respect and admire your actions. So do you have any closing thoughts on a young person should do to have an interesting life like you're doing? And
Yeah, I think try new things. This wasn't my planned path in life. It's not, what I thought that I would do. I didn't necessarily grow up with an avid interest in geopolitics or wars or the world. I was a trained ballerina and thought that was going to be my path in life. I broke my ankle and I ended up in New York when I was 19 and got an internship, and that's how I was sponsored and stayed here. So it was not something that was planned, but I think just be as open as you can to opportunities and see the world, see as much of the world as you can, because you can read 20, 30 books on a subject, but you will never understand it the way you would when you're actually there, immersed with the locals, experiencing the local foods and cuisines, and really understanding it from a ground perspective. So if you're young and agile and have a keen eye for adventure, then just do what you can to kind of get out there and travel and pursue the things that interest you. Go to the places that interest you. And that's not necessarily, I'm not encouraging you to go to a frontline off the bat, but certainly to a region or to a place where you feel that you can kind of enhance your knowledge. And you may absolutely decide that you hate it and this is not for you, but you may also decide that there is opportunities in that path.
well, I'm glad I followed my own advice, which is basically your advice. When I was a young man, I always wanted to see the world. So that's why I went in the Navy and the CIA and ended up in international businesses. So I ended up visiting 50 countries and spent a couple of years living in Hong Kong. So but I must admit, my idea of roughing it is not having access to my American Express card. So I'm not so sure I would have enjoyed Afghanistan and Sudan, but I take my hat off to you for doing all those adventurous things. And keep up the good work. It's really been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. It's an honor to come on anytime.
Thank you. Take care, Holly.
Thank you.